First off, thank you for coming. And I want to thank everybody at Full Stack Toronto for inviting me up here to speak. I was very honored to have this opportunity, so it's been great. Toronto is a pretty awesome city. It's the first time I've been here where I've been able to stay more than a couple of days. I was, earlier this week, I actually was in a different city in the United States. It was actually Kansas City. So if any of you are baseball fans, I'm sorry. They were pretty stoked. But to be perfectly honest, I am a Cubs fan. So I feel your pain, because we both kind of got shafted there at the end of the year. If I go kind of fast, it's because Notre Dame football starts at 3:30, and I kind of want to see that. I'm kidding. I'm going to take my time and give it its full due. I'm just teasing. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, basically what I want to talk about today is like our current development world and what we live in. Sometimes actually just getting to the point where you're building an application, it's a non-trivial amount of time, right? You don't necessarily even get to the point where you're writing code initially because you have so many different considerations to even think about before you get to that point. You got to pick, first off, you usually pick a language. Sometimes you get the luxury of picking it yourself. A lot of times you don't even have that choice. You're sort of forced into picking a specific language based on what you're doing. Then you need to start thinking about the different runtimes and operating systems, the different data storage potential that you need to do, all the different frameworks you want to use, continuous integration, DevOps, I mean, all these different pieces, all the deployment strategies, monitoring, different workflows that you need to build out. And this is all before you even really write any application code. There's just a lot of considerations there to think about. My question is why? Like, we're going into 2016 and we're still doing things in a way that is so laborious and so time-consuming that it's actually just, it's painful, and I feel like sometimes it actually hurts our innovation on the front end and the applications themselves. So my name is Kelly Andrews, and I'm a developer evangelist for Syncano. I'm not going to talk about the product. If you want to talk about the product, I have a booth. Go down there and we can chat. But I'm also a front-end developer, pretty much always have been. And I want to tell you a little bit about my story and how I got here, and maybe this will resonate with some of you. So I'm definitely not what you would call classically trained, right? I don't have a CS degree. I actually have a BFA in graphic design. I was originally a voice major. I kind of backdoored my way into development because I wanted to. And I can remember even back as early as kindergarten, like playing with various programs in BASIC, working through them like on a word processor or an Apple IIe, just to kind of see some things like maybe draw Garfield in ASCII, right? I mean, this was, you know, I'm not going to give away my age, but this was a long time ago. Throughout middle school, I mean, I loved technology. I would tear my computer apart so I could play X-Wing versus TIE Fighter. Or I needed to upgrade because the new Diablo came out and my graphics processor wasn't working. So I would tear my computer apart. I loved all that stuff. In high school, I actually took classes on Scheme and Pascal. And I thoroughly just loved doing it. It was something that made sense in my head, the logic, the process. I just sank my teeth into it, really enjoyed it. And actually dabbled in it a little bit in college. So like, I built my first web page. And it was really bad, right? I had Starfield backgrounds, I had rotating GIF images, centered text all the way down and up and down the page. It was horribly awesome and horribly bad at the same time, right? I pushed files to a server, call a URL. Holy cow, I built that. It's on the web. This is awesome, right? Kind of like this, right? This is how we were doing it back then. Really, really bad. And I kind of realized that there was definitely a separation between functionality and beauty on the web. For the longest time, being a front-end developer and a front-end engineer and a UX guy or UI guy, or female, apologize for that, you didn't combine the two. You would have an engineer who could build something very functional, but it looked horrible, kind of like this. Or you build something really pretty, but it didn't actually work, right? There wasn't really much functionality there. Right, it didn't look good. So yeah, I tried to do the computer science thing the second semester of my freshman year in college. I just could not get into understanding like joining tables in SQL, C++, Java. I mean, all those different like technologies to me, they just didn't work. I didn't get it. I don't know why, but instead I spent most of my time at college learning graphic design, because I knew that someday I wanted to build websites that were both functional and good to look at. And essentially at that point, we didn't have a name for it, but that's what has eventually turned into the front-end engineer. So what did I do? Maybe some of you have gone through this, but I spent the next few years scrambling, just trying to understand like MySQL, Linux server administration, trying to build an entire operation that would work and be functional. Trying to understand data security, how to connect it all to some framework. And I found some hope, right? I mean, some frameworks, some site frameworks abstract a lot of these pieces away, like Drupal, Joomla, WordPress. So some of these things were interesting to me. I started to figure them out, try to understand them. Still a lot of difficulty there. In fact, Drupal currently installs about 70 tables. I hear that's going to change soon. But it's a massive amount of overhead. And if you don't really understand everything that's going on, extending it and using it properly to its full advantage is not an easy process. There's also a lot of PHP involved, right? And that's not necessarily a front-end language. So you had to do a lot more development than you probably expected. I still required local server for like my own processes, understanding how that worked, getting a host server, writing templates, still felt like back-end development to me. And you ended up spending so much time understanding the API itself and the hooks more than just building. You could buy a template, which everyone then knows you bought a template because it looks like a template. And then if you want to go anywhere outside of that template, again, it's more code, it's more work. Now you're trying to understand that, and you go through a whole lot of pain. So I put those away and I tried different options like CodeIgniter or Cake PHP. Zend, Ruby on Rails, tried a whole bunch of different frameworks. None of them really worked for me, because it was all just backend, and it wasn't what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was I wanted to build the front end. I wanted to build things that looked good, were functional, but I didn't have to go through this process of creating all of these different pieces. I was still just horrible at building the back end. But as an industry, we started recognizing some of the difficulties we had, right? So we have Rackspace, DigitalOcean, GoDaddy. They started building things that would allow you, instead of going through the process of standing up a server and security administration and all that kind of stuff, you could just simply have these guys do it for you. Done, right? Other companies start to make it easier for you to start a server. You're able to find the products. They had templates for like different CMS sites. They had different frameworks, so you could just basically one-click install and you're ready to go. Run some scripts and all the server administration was there for you. Unfortunately, you still had to build everything, right? You still had a lot of that back-end work that you had to go through. Even now, we have other solutions. We have like Cloud Foundry, Heroku, AWS, which ironically is sort of the same thing. Google App Engine, that kind of thing. These like infrastructure as a service vendors. And if you kind of notice the pattern, we've been abstracting things as we move through the process. So we started by just building straight HTML sites and then hosting them up on a file server. You had to build all that stuff out. Then now things are starting to get a little different, right? Now you don't have to necessarily do the server administration, and you don't have to maintain Make sure your Linux box is up to date, even in like rack space and that kind of thing. But even with infrastructure as a service, you still have to build all the backend code. So the server administration part is gone. Backend code still exists. There's other products, Cloudant, Elephant SQL, Compose. They've made setting up the database portion of this much easier. You don't have to necessarily go through all the pieces to build those out. You can connect very quickly, but your backend still requires you to build out REST routes and user authentication, and it's just not my comfort zone. Then we ended up, Node, right? Oh my gosh, I can do JavaScript, I can do backend because of Node. Well, not really, right? Because even though I like JavaScript, I still don't really understand how the server should work, how the backend should work, how security authentication should work, user management, database management. This is where things can go horribly wrong for me. So typically, if you're a front-end developer, it requires you to go find somebody who can do this. And that's just not fair, right? I don't have a bunch of friends who can do back-end development in their spare time to help me build a project. So why is it I have to suffer because I can't do this, right? I can't tell you how many just great ideas, and I'm sure they were all just, the next big thing, right? The next startup unicorn, right? I'm sure they weren't, but I'm just kidding. So I can't tell you how many of them died because I wasn't able to build a back-end. I get a great UI, great front end going. I'd have all the functionality I needed. And then I get to the back end, and I'm just like, throw my hands up, I'm out. So it's, like I said earlier, why should I have to, right? It's 2015. Why do I need to do all this still? What are we actually solving there? Now, if you're a back-end developer and you're here just to troll me or whatever, that's great. And I want to hear all that too. But even with microservices and all the different changes we have, what are we innovating? What's being innovated on the back end? It's REST API CRUD routes, data management, some kind of action like sending an email, user authentication. I'm not intending to oversimplify it. Right? I understand that it's a complex process. That's why I don't touch it, because it is a complex process. But it's just sort of like, things have kind of come to a place where they've run their course, I guess is what I'm trying to say there. There's not a whole lot of new problems being solved. It's kind of doing the same thing. You set up a server, you build your REST routes, you build your data management, that kind of thing. Sort of the same thing over and over. Okay. So data storage, user authentication, REST routes, sending emails, right? All right, I'm done. Okay, so we're not exactly the only ones to go through these kind of changes, right? So I got some images up here which may or may not make sense to some of you, but as a graphic design major, I had to go through a lot of these processes. So we have calligraphy, RubyLith, typesetting. These are all, at this point, archaic technology. You actually don't have people really doing these in a professional environment that much, unless they're highly specialized and they're paid a lot of money to do it. But the reason for that is that guy, right? Technology came along in an industry that had pretty much been unchanged for a very long time. All the screen printing, cut and paste, typesetting, calligraphy, all those skills were great to learn, but at some point we had to, once Photoshop came along and took those away, you have to learn those pieces. Why? Because that's what the industry is going to do. So this abstracted all those different pieces that people were doing, all the typesetting, all the different RubyLithing, and all these different pieces are now gone, virtually gone. Because you took a huge group of people who used to do something like magazine layout, and you have slimmed it down to now a very small subset of that former group. Because the tools have made it now easier to perform those functions. You didn't need an expert who could do hand drawings. You didn't need an expert to do X, Y, Z. Those have now been replaced by a technology. You can find other examples though, right? How much has a car changed in 100 years? It's basically all at the core level: 4 wheels, seats, steering, it drives, right? What's changed is the interface, the way we use it, the way we interact with it, how it protects us, right? There's different things there that have changed, but all 3 of those images are basically the exact same thing. At the core level, the exact same thing. Well, we're no different, right? I think these are the changes we're going through now. And I think as an industry, we haven't quite figured it out yet. We're still holding on to some old things. But there's so many as-a-service platforms out there that have just trended this direction of abstracting all of these difficulties away. It's not to remove a job. I don't think it's to essentially do that, but it's to increase productivity. And ultimately, the end goal is to increase the innovation and the speed to get there. So let's talk a little bit about what that kind of looks like. So I'm going to do a little bit more of architectural diagrams now, and we'll, as soon as they're going to be horribly complicated, but we'll talk through it a little bit and see what it looks like and how it's changing. So the core of current architecture practice is sort of this base layer. You have data storage, you have some sort of service, whether it's sending emails, notifications, messaging, that kind of stuff. Some sort of business logic. That kind of all lies in this sort of core layer. All those things work together to produce the results that you need to produce, to eventually push out into an API and data transformation layer. So essentially, this is just the path. I mean, this is going to be the path that our client-side code takes to get to data storage or to utilize services and the business logic that exists. It also lets us be very specific in how we expose these things. Then on top of that, you're going to have some sort of authentication layer. So you don't just give everybody access to this thing. You can guarantee that the right person gets to the right place at the right time. And then it goes through the cloud, right? Finally, we hit, mobile devices, laptops, desktops, IoT devices, all using the cloud to go through the authentication layer, to go through the data transformation API, to get to those data pieces. Pretty much most applications follow some sort of architecture diagram that looks like this. This is obviously really simplified, and I'm sure that you can show me your diagram and it's really hard to follow. Most of them are going to be more complex than this. This is just sort of boiling it down to an essence in sorts. But, I mean, essentially, that's not the right way to do it. Let's talk about serverless architecture. Okay, so this is kind of a new buzzword. I don't know how new exactly it is. But I think things start to get a little interesting here. So one misconception about this has been, in the serverless architecture, we actually eliminate the server altogether. And that's not entirely true, right? There is some server. There's going to be a front-end server to run the app. And there may be some server to run services that need to be behind kind of a proxy of sorts. I think the name's still emerging, still being tweaked, toyed with. Some people don't like it. Maybe it's not the best wording, but I'm going to kind of stick with it for now because it makes sense in my head and seems to be an accurate description. So what actually constitutes serverless architecture? So there's certainly some things that we've all started to agree upon that the parameters fit and make an app considered serverless. So the main consideration here is going to be that you don't actually own the server, right? So some of those infrastructure as a service are very similar to this, but there's other ones like, so using like Heroku or AWS as a server is definitely one way to go through that. But not only do you not own it, but you don't maintain it, right? So all the pieces to the server are not something that you have to keep up to date. So if there's security flaws in some sort of, some sort of security layer you need to update, you don't have to worry about doing that yourself. So like DigitalOcean, Rackspace, not exactly perfect solutions for this, and I don't think they count because you maintain the server and you have to keep it up to date and secure. Front-end code rules the roost here. Essentially, like 90 to 95% of your code base is going to be all front-end, JavaScript, front-end frameworks, that kind of thing, allowing you to focus mostly on the interaction and the experience and less on the actual backend. So I talked about this a little bit ago, but server code is proxy only. So you're going to need API keys not exposed on the client side, so this is where those go. So when you do host a server, you're going to need some sort of proxy that'll allow you to call these services and expose them in a very specific way. That way you can perform the tasks that you need to perform outside of your application without exposing yourself to security risks. But if you start finding yourself adding like databases, you're probably going to be doing it wrong. So. And then the front-end code is essentially a conductor, right? It's the director of the whole thing. So you're not making decisions on the back end on what's going to happen for the user. The front end is doing all of that for you. So essentially, that's where most of the business logic gets moved to. And let's look at how that architecture comes together. So this would be, the server would be a minimal API, right? Something to send email, something to add a user. Very, very small pieces of functionality. And then above that is going to be the cloud, right? Then you're going to use some cloud service to do your auth. Right? This is not something that you're doing yourself. You're using somebody else to actually do it. Some other service, if you're sending an email, doing messaging, anything of that nature, that's where that's going to belong. Your data is going to exist outside of your server as well. Right? You're going to call into something else and use that service as opposed to building it out. And that all happens through the cloud from your client. Right? So the client handles all the data transformation, gets all the pieces from the different services that you've set up, and then calls those through your minimal API. Business logic also happens here. Right? So any runtime decisions that are important to how your business operates, those are all going to happen here as well. So what does it look like when you replace those with different pieces, right? So for authentication, use auth0, auth0. I'm not sure how to pronounce that actually. Maybe use Couchbase as your data storage. And then you need Stripe to process payments and SendGrid to send emails. That kind of thing. So essentially what you're doing is you're offloading building all of these things, right? At this point, all you're going to do is you're going to make a small connector. It goes from one piece to the other. Your minimal API allows you to call in and talk to those. So that feels a lot better to me. But it goes a little further, right? So serverless architecture is definitely a good thing. But there's also, there's a site called nobackend.org, okay? And it talks more about not just serverless architecture, but actually doing a app first, like so browser or mobile device, that kind of thing, and thinking about that before ever thinking about the server at all. So your app should function if there's no server involved. So this is kind of just a place where it's all things no backend at all. You can read and learn different ways that they're thinking about this. And as a front-end developer, to me, it's really awesome to know that people have been thinking about this. It allows me to know that the future of innovation is actually going to be on the back end. So what does some of the code look like, right? If you want to add users, user.add username and password. So now I don't even think about what the actual REST route here has to be because I'm using some service that allows me to do this. I don't need to go through the process of creating the security and bringing back an OAuth token or however your mechanism is for authentication. I don't have to go through all those pieces. Someone else has thought through all that for me. So I can implement something that looks like this on my front-end code, and I'm done, right? I don't have to do anything else. I don't have to go through the process of getting this all ready to go. And it's all basically the same kind of thing. If I want to add new data, new records, data.add, right? I mean, something like that. I pass in some attributes. When it's done, I get a new object back, and I can use that object in my front-end code. Something goes wrong, I can do that as well. If I want to update it, maybe it's just an event that comes back from the service. Something like Firebase does this really well too, right? You watch a specific data object, and as that data object gets changes made to it, it posts back to your front end, and you get to see that and act in it real time. And you don't have to consider all of the different implications it takes to do real-time synchronization and building out sockets and making sure those stay up and running and that kind of thing. So why not? It's 2015, let's do this, right? And then sending an email. Maybe it's just a function, right? Send email, send a subject, text to. Maybe it gets a little more complicated than that. But on the general surface, why isn't send email on a function that I can use today? Instead, I have to go through the process of building out all the different pieces that it takes to make that work. Oh, we're all working on it, right? This is not any one person leading a charge. There's a lot of people thinking about this right now. There's so many different options to try. It's hard to pick. Some of them are better than others. Some of them do different things than others. Some focus more on real time. Some focus strictly on mobile as opposed to mobile and browser. Some of them are better at data synchronization than others. Some kind of do just user authentication really well. Some put all of it together and try to control all of it at once. But it's definitely a different philosophy. Right? It's not the same thing we've been thinking about, where when you sit down to write an app, the first thing you need to do is start building out all the pieces to make the front end run. Because the front end is where the innovation is going. That's what the user touches. Now, it takes all the back-end stuff to be able to make that work, but we end up spending so much time getting the back end just right that we don't actually focus on what the user interacts with. And that's where I think the biggest miss is. That's where the loss of this forward progress and innovation happens, is we worry so much about how we're deploying and how we're going to continue the continuous integration and how we're going to do data monitoring and how we're going to, all these different factors go into this, and we get this great back end, and it's like, oh, here's a minimum viable product for a front end. And it does like half the things we really want it to do. And that's what users want. That's what users are doing, right? They go to your application because of what it does, not because of how the backend works. So just to kind of wrap everything up, it's a little bit older, but Tim Berners-Lee was quoted as saying, "The web as I envisioned it, we've not seen it yet. Future is still so much bigger than the past." And I think he's absolutely right. I think we, at some point, need to get out of our own way, let the innovation happen, keep driving that innovation to make things on the front end better, more interactive, more intuitive, focus on the user's experience and less about how our business works on the back end. Obviously, it's an important piece because your backend needs to do all the things that it needs to do to make the front end work. But I don't think we have to spend as much time writing code line by line to get to that point. We just have to recognize the changes, right? We have to be open to it. We have to be willing to think through. Maybe it's time to try to shake things up a little bit. Try things in a different way than we've done in the past. If you find yourself wanting to write something, and the first thing you do is you go sit down and start building out a MongoDB and hooking up Express API routes to it, maybe you ought to think differently. Try it a different way. Try it without building a server first, and focus on the users and who's actually going to be exploring your app. So I think being a front-end developer today is more exciting than ever. And if we're not having to build these backends, we can certainly do it at a faster pace than ever before. So, thank you. That's it.